And thank you, everyone. It's great to be here with you for our second session of In Conversation in 2023. And I want to most of all thank Renata in advance for her willingness to share her life experiences and wisdom here today. Oh, and I just want to remind everyone, I know that for anyone who's just joined the call, we're going to mute our microphones just to make sure that we don't distract from the conversation, okay? So we will have time though for questions, as Elise just mentioned, and we welcome all questions and comments in the chat. So before we begin the discussion, I wanted to just share a very brief summary of Renata's experiences during the Holocaust for anyone who has not had the honor of hearing her speak before. Renate Krakauer was born in Stanisławice, Poland, which is now Ivano-Frankivsk, Ukraine. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing. In 1941, in what was at that time a part of the Soviet zone of occupation. Life was relatively normal for the Krakauer family until the Nazis broke the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in 1941 and headed east into the USSR. Suddenly, the Jews of Stanisławice were forced into a ghetto, and the horrific killings began, most notably during the Black Sunday massacre, when 12,000 Jews were murdered at the hands of the SS. Renata's family was lucky that day and eluded the massacre simply because there was no knock on their door. Conditions in the ghetto, however, were terrible, and the young Renata barely survived. When her parents saw this danger, her mother bravely decided to hand baby Renata over to a Polish family who raised her during the remainder of the war. As the war came to an end and the German army retreated, Renata's parents were able to come out of hiding in the summer of 1944 and were reunited with one another and with their daughter. They lived out the remainder of the war in the renewed Soviet zone of occupation and decided to head to Germany with the descent into communism and what that implied for the Jewish community. Renata's family decided not to live under communist rule. And so they spent time in a displaced persons camp in Eggenfelden in Germany before making their way to Canada in 1948. And I do hope, Renata, that was all correct, but please feel free to correct anything that I misspoke on there. But my first question for you was whether you have any direct memories from this time during the Holocaust. I know you were a very young child during the time, but do you have any direct memories?
Before I answer your question, Elena, Krakauer was not my family name.
Oh.
Tannenzapf, and here's the book if people are interested at some point. It's my father's memoir and mine. William Tannenzapf, my mother was Charlotte Tannenzapf. Just a minor thing.
Not a minor thing at all, but good, thanks.
But no, I don't have any memories of that time before I was 4 years old. And I know I've always marveled that there are people who have memories, 3.5 and 3 and so on. But I actually feel very lucky that I don't remember, because I think that blank of that blanked out period, whether I've blanked it out or whether I just didn't have don't remember. I think I was blessed.
Understandably so. That, yeah, to have memories of that period would have they wouldn't have been positive memories, I'm sure.
Well, I was, as you've described, I was 5 months old when the Nazis occupied our part of Poland. And actually, it was not Poland at the time. By that time, as you mentioned, it was under the Soviet Union. And, I was there until I was 1.5 years or a little more. And it was a very deprived early childhood. There was no food in the ghetto. My mother had to eventually get herself onto slave labor to be classified as a worker. So she was able to get out of the ghetto to work at one of the Nazi factories that they had on the outside, so she could bring in food. And she used to tell me she couldn't talk about it. She was one of these people who was not able to talk about it. she cried. Whenever I asked her anything, she would start to cry, and I couldn't bear her tears. But the one thing she always used to say was, "You were so sad." She would use the Polish word smutna. "You were so sad," and you would see me coming and you would break into this big smile because I was hungry. I was, and I missed her all day. So, I mean, do I want to be sorry that I don't remember that? No, I'm glad I don't remember that.
Understandably so. And I think that really, the next question that I wanted to ask you, I think it definitely connects with that, your especially I'm sure the experience of your parents, but what was, do you think, the psychological impact, maybe for yourself, but also, more broadly for your family? And how did this shape your early development, your early relationships and sense of identity?
Well, I don't know how far along you want me to go. I understand that psychologists do say that the first 5 years are very important for your eventual development. But I think that one of the things that happened, of course, is that I was very close to my mother. She was my lifeline, and as you've described, she smuggled me out of the ghetto. But before that, there were many very frightening events. The Nazis were extremely cruel to children. They would take young children and bash their heads against the wall. And when there were raids, or what they called actions, anybody who was hiding with a child uh, would be fair game. So when my mother managed to get this labor outside, so that she could, because when you were outside the ghetto walls, you could barter for food. She had my father's cousin's wife, who also had a child,
Oh my God.
look after me while she was out. And one time she came back and she found
What the hell?
that this cousin's wife was feeding her child the food that my mother had left for me. So it really hurt her, but she could understand that this child was hungry too. Another time she said, and she also, my mother was a pharmacist, so she would leave phenobarb powder with this woman so that when there were these raids, periodic raids, and nobody wanted to hide with a child, she would give it to me and I would be asleep. And at one point, apparently, this woman told her she saw that one of these police or Gestapo or whoever came raiding, they had the gun pointed at my head. But the other guy said, leave her alone. We'll get her when we get her family. They thought, so it was a close escape. So there was hunger, there was deprivation, there was poverty, but there was my mother, and my mother loved me and basically, gave her life. I mean, she would not have survived the war if it had not been that she was so determined to save her child. So I think that was something that, I was very close to my mother for the rest of my life. I don't know if any of that period of time had an impact psychologically, but certainly I imagine that when my mother left me with the Polish widow and her two boys in this poverty-stricken village, we were in this shack with the thatched roof, and she and her two sons and I slept between her and the boys. We all slept in one big bed. We all ate out of one big bowl, and I've thought, well, that must have been traumatic to be given away, abandoned by your mother. On the other hand, this woman loved me and she was very kind to me and she considered me like her little daughter. She had two boys and then suddenly she had this little daughter, and sometimes I wonder if I actually remember the inside of the church. I've had flashes of the inside of this little church because they used to take me to church with them. So I think that mitigated whatever, of course, then at the end of the war, she had to give me back. And again, I didn't know my parents. So there were like two periods where I think must have been traumatic. And I sometimes think I must have abandonment issues, you know, but I'm not a psychologist, so I don't know. I think that, that the love, I feel very strongly that if there's enough love, it overcomes a lot of negativity and a lot of potential harm.
I think I agree. And I do think that, especially when it comes to the survival of young children like yourself, it is, a testament to the love and to the strength of a lot of the Jewish parents who made incredible sacrifices and very difficult decisions. And I just wonder if you could share, Renata, do you know why the Polish widow decided to take you in?
Well, I mean, on a crass level, it was because my parents gave her whatever money they had.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, she took a big risk. If you were hiding a Jew, you got shot if you were found out. So I think that there was a little bit, maybe initially it was a housekeeper in my uncle's house, a Polish woman, connected my mother with this woman, and she took me on. But she, I'm sure, had to consider whether it was worth the risk. And I think that probably many of the people in that village knew I was a Jewish child. But, for some reason, they didn't betray me. There was one incident I know my father tells in his memoir, how this was a Polish village surrounded by Ukrainian villages. And the Ukrainians and the Poles hated each other. And so these Ukrainians came on a raid one night, and they set fire to all the thatched roofs of the village homes. And somehow my mother would have said it was a miracle. My father said, just a stroke of luck, some reason. The one, the shack that I was in did not go up in flames. And that Sunday in church, the priest used that opportunity to preach to the congregation that God punishes those who betray the innocent. And to that effect, because he knew I was a Jewish child. So I think the people being very religious, my father said they were very superstitious, but I think they were genuinely very religious, and they would not go against what the priest said. So there was a lot of luck in there. And my mother called me her miracle baby, and I am here to prove that we're right.
You are a miracle. And your survival, it is a miracle. And, that's something that I know that there were, yes, the actions of the Polish widow and of your parents and other people along the way, but it is a miracle that, any Jewish children survived that time.
1.5 million children were murdered by the Nazis. And those few of us who survived, really, it was
miraculous is the right word for it. Yeah. So maybe that brings, and you mentioned as well your father and his testimony, and I think it's fascinating. So you published your memoir in 2009, and it's called Memories from the Abyss, which is your father's testimony, correct? And then also your component, but I had a happy childhood. So it's sort of both perspectives. And I am ashamed to say I have not yet read it, but I absolutely will be reading it following our program today. And I wanted to just hear you explain a little bit, where does this title come from? Because it seems kind of contradictory.
Well, it is contradictory. You're quite right. And in fact, the editors were not happy with me for choosing that title. But, the introduction is written by Professor Michael Brown, from York University. I don't know if he's still there. And I remember when we had this discussion with the editors, and he looked at me and I looked at him, he said, it's a good title. Because he understood it was ironic and it was contradictory. And I think what I was trying to cover there was, yes, the early part of my childhood was, anything but happy from what my mother tells me. I was hungry, I was deprived. I wasn't walking till I was way past the age of 2 because there was nowhere to walk. I didn't have any fresh air. They never took me out. I was put to sleep with the phenobarb. I mean, really. And then I was given away. But once I was with my caregiver, my foster mother, as I call her, I toddled around there. My parents made sure the last coin my mother had went to this woman to buy a goat so I could have milk because I wasn't walking. The child needs milk. My father, who came later, he escaped later and my mother would not let him hide with her because it was too dangerous. But he used to come over and visit. And they used to spy on me through a crack in the attic. And he would say, "Oh, the child's not walking. We have to do something." So the goat was the way they got the milk for me to walk. But then by the time I started walking, and those 2 boys who didn't like me very much at first, because who was this interloper, began to see me as their little sister. And I would toddle around and I had the freedom of the yard, and what did I know about danger? I was happy. That part of it, I was happy. After, when my parents came to get me, I didn't recognize them. I thought my father was the boogeyman. I mean, a thick head of black hair. And they were damaged people. I mean, today you would call it PTSD, overprotective to some extent. And in fact, in one period of time, when my father made it a point, we had moved to the American protected part of Poland. They had a store, and he made it a point to put all the best food on the table that he could get on the black market, right? And I wouldn't eat. I wasn't hungry. And it drove him crazy. So he used to spank me. He used to turn me over his knee, pull down my pants. He would spank me. My mother couldn't stand it. She would run out of the room. And I, of course, would be screaming my head off. And then she would come back and I can't say I was happy at that period of time in my life, right? But, I think back on that, and he never laid a finger on me again after we left that Poland. But at that time, nobody knew about PTSD. I remember reading Helen Epstein's book. Have you ever read it? Children of the Holocaust. That was the first book I ever read. And I remember the scene where she describes her father and his fury that her brother wouldn't eat. And all of a sudden, I had an example there of someone who had the same experience as me. So yeah, and then coming to Canada was again another major change. But I think so the effect, I think what it really did, the one thing that I think you can think of all the negative things, you can think of all the, as my parents said, we're neurotic, but don't tell anybody. What we went through the early years, don't tell anybody because they'll think that we, after what we went through, we can't be normal. But, I think my parents were very strong people, and I think they were very resilient, and they made a good life for themselves in Canada. And I think that, I kind of became resilient too. I was a pretty self-possessed, a confident little kid. I made friends wherever I went. I mean, I didn't have a really hard time adjusting to, to whatever circumstances. I remember in the DP camp, I made lots of friends there. They even put me up on a stage. I had to sing a song. I was 6 years old. I had to sing a song in Hebrew. I hadn't even how I learned Hebrew, I don't know. And so, I did it, they asked me to do what I did. So I learned to roll with the punches, I guess.
I absolutely, well, and even just even if you don't have direct memories, being moved around and placed into different environments. And yeah, I think that probably made you very adaptable and resilient
Yes, I
from a
think
very
that's
young
it.
age.
Yeah, yeah.
Absolutely. And Renata, what you were saying just stimulated another question. I was curious about when you were reunited with your parents and in your early childhood, did you have a sense of being Jewish? You said that you'd
Oh,
attended church in Poland, and so what was your sense of Jewishness like for you?
well, I don't think I was actually conscious of that. Although I'll tell you, my father, both my parents, they were determined. One of the main reasons, as you alluded to, why we left um, Soviet occupied Poland, and which became, by the way, Ukraine, and it was a Ukrainian socialist republic or whatever under the USSR. When we were about to leave and we couldn't leave legally, there was this requirement that we had to become Soviet citizens, and we were Polish citizens. And when my mother told us, she was a manager of a pharmacy under the Soviets. And she told her assistant we were leaving, and her assistant looked at her like she was crazy. She said, "This place is a paradise for children, and you're leaving." So, so and one of the reasons was fear, because these NKVD, which was a secret police, was always, spying on my mother. What was she doing with the drugs? But the sense of anti-Semitism, what we left, because my parents, my father especially, was very strong on this. They tried to kill us because we were Jews, and as a result, we're not going to hide our Jewishness. We're going to go somewhere where we can be proud Jews, where we can live in the open as Jews. We weren't like my parents had their own version of being Orthodox, very eclectic. Always went to an Orthodox synagogue, but didn't always follow all the rules, because being Jews in an open society and openly Jewish was extremely important to them. And so I don't know when I became consciously aware of it, probably not till we arrived in Canada. Um, but yeah, I don't think that, I don't think that kind of thing was really on my radar till I was in the DP camp, where everybody was Jewish.
Sure. Yes. No, that's
Where my
actually very interesting. Yeah.
Well, it was a very interesting experience there, because we were there for 2 years, and for my parents, education was always the most important thing. And here I was of school age, and there was no school. So my father decided he was going to start a school for the children, the DP camp. It didn't make him a lot of friends. People were very upset about it, actually, because they did not intend to linger. They wanted to get out of there. They weren't interested. But he went ahead, and he's got a school started. He went to the Germans in the town, and he got desks, and he got a room in this house, old house, and we learned in Hebrew. We had a teacher, it was called Moreh, and yeah, we had a school, and that was all part of, we learned to read. We learned the Hebrew alphabet, before we learned the other, the regular, the Arabic, or whatever you call it, alphabet. And so that was all part of of identity as Jews, and the importance of education for 2 years. So we didn't just languish there.
Right. Well, and I think there's something so powerful about the image of, young Jewish children in the immediate aftermath of the Holocaust learning Hebrew in a German
Yeah.
displaced persons camp. That's amazing. Uh, well, okay. So, and the question that I have next is kind of going back again to the division of Poland, right? Because this is something that I find really fascinating. And we don't always hear as much about people that were living, more on the sort of eastern end of the Polish territory. And so, can you lend any insight for us into how, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and how Poland was divided into East and West? Like, how did that impact the Jewish people living in those territories?
Well, it's interesting. I'm glad you asked that question because it's one of the reasons I do these talks to students, because I don't think that there's a lot of knowledge, even in the Jewish community, about that part of Poland. Like our city, Stanislavov, had a population of about 25,000 Jews, and maximum 200 survived. So you don't really get the word, like people don't even have never heard of it. They don't know what it is. And when I first used to say, well, where were you born in Stanislav? Where is that? Oh, so where were you during the war? Well, I was part of the time I was in the ghetto. Oh, you were in the Warsaw Ghetto. No, people have heard of the Warsaw Ghetto. They don't know there's about 1,000 ghettos throughout Poland. But what they don't know is that in Eastern Europe, and I often recommend a wonderful book called Bloodlands by Timothy Snyder, where he talks about Hitler and Stalin. And the part about Hitler tells you more about what happened in Eastern Europe to the Jews. What happened in our part of Poland, which changed hands frequently, used to be part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then the First World War. At the end of the First World War, the Allies carved up Europe, and Poland, for a first time in many years, became an independent republic. And where we were was part of Poland, and many Jews know it as Galicia. But in 1939, the Nazis invaded Poland. They annexed most of Poland. They did not touch our part because this Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Molotov being the foreign minister of the Soviet Union and Ribbentrop representing Hitler, and the Nazis didn't want to be attacked. They didn't want to have to fight on the East Front and the West Front. So they thought if they came to this agreement and they gave that part of Poland over to the Soviet Union. Now, how that affected Jews, for many Jews, it was the first of a step in a very bad situation. They were deported to Siberia into labor camps. For the few other Jews, like my parents, who were both professionals, who had not had an opportunity to practice their profession. My mother was a pharmacist, my dad was an electrical engineer, and they'd had to take whatever work they could get because it was the Depression in the 20s too. As soon as the Soviets took over, immediately they got good jobs. My mother got a job in a pharmacy. My father got a job, I think at that time was first in a radio station. And so they were, they felt they didn't have anything to fear from the Nazis because they trusted this big Soviet Union had this big army, and they because I used to ask them, why didn't you leave? You heard what was going on in the rest of Europe. Oh, well, they got married in 39 and they decided they'd have a kid, in 41. And they thought the life would go on and they would be able to, they thought it was horrible what was happening, whatever they heard they didn't have internet in those days. They didn't have news on their television. Nevertheless, what happened was that ultimately Hitler decided that after he looked after the Western Front, they invaded all the countries of Western Europe. Now it was time to spread into the Soviet Union to get more Lebensraum for his people. And no matter how strong the Soviet army was, they left. And they left us to for the Nazis to deal with us.
Right. Wow, that's a good summary, and I admire that because I know it can be very difficult to sum it up concisely. But I think it's difficult to capture all of the experiences of different Jewish communities, because with the Holocaust happening across a continent, there are so many different experiences, and the borders are constantly shifting. Illustrates that, that's partly why we want to make sure that one narrative isn't sort of dominating our understanding of the Holocaust. Okay, and so you've already answered my next question, which is, why did your parents decide to leave the Soviet Union? But my next question kind of is a connection to that, which is, as a young child, so you were describing the education you were getting in the displaced persons camp in Eggenfelden. Do you have any memories from being in that camp, or was that again, a period that
Oh,
you pretty
I
spotty?
I would say that I'm past the age of 4. I start, I have a pretty good memory. I have pretty good memory in the place that we were before, which was in the Allied part of Poland, in a place called Brzeg nad Odrą. It was just a little town near what is now Wrocław, or what was Breslau under Germany. When my father was in business with another guy, they had a store. And so I remember quite a bit of that. But once we got into our trajectory was through a couple of DP camps before we ended up in Eggenfelden, because they were all full. The DP camps were full. And my parents tell the story about how they, first of all, we were in one camp, which was really a refugee camp, where we lived in a tent. And, I had a lot of fun with the other kids, plus, whenever it rains, splashing around in the rain. But my parents used to tell me, well, because of their early scouting experience, they dug a trench around their tent, so their tent didn't get flooded out like so many other people. But when we got to Eggenfelden, how they got in there was that they knew the brother of the man who was head of the committee there. And my mother said, I put on a real good show. I cried and I said, I've got this child. We need a place to live. And as it turned out, yeah, we didn't live right inside the camp. We were lucky. We had very elegant quarters because my father was given a job by the Americans as the director of an ORT school. I don't know if you knew what ORT was, the Organization for Rehabilitation Through Training. These were training schools set up for training these remnants of survivors, and many of them came from small communities where they didn't have any kind of what we would call employable skills. They taught electronics, they taught tailoring, they taught plumbing. And so we got a room in a big old apartment. We had one room for the 3 of us with a little stove and with a bathroom down the hall. And we thought we were like in heaven because we didn't have to live in dormitories, It was at that point where, yeah, and I remember the landlady there, because my mother got ill. I never did find out what was wrong with her. I have a secret. I always, I asked whenever I asked, it was a big secret. Couldn't tell. I think maybe, my father said, oh yeah, when they discovered penicillin, then she got healthy. They gave her a shot of penicillin because she was in Munich. She was in the hospital. And I had to be left with the landlady of this building. I was a German, probably a Nazi, but it didn't matter. She was good to me. But I think, I don't know, why my mother had to go. There was this thing that the doctors didn't know what was wrong with her. Maybe it was some female problems. It was just very hush hush. And she was not in great shape emotionally. I think that we never knew what PTSD was. Maybe that hit her. I don't know. But I
Well, yeah.
loved being in Eggenfeld, and I had a good time with the other kids.
And for a child, and almost you know, the ignorance, the innocence, it protects you and cushions you from that reality, right? And I
Absolutely.
I think you're, you know, it's thank you for sharing that about your mother. And I'm sure, I think, you know, for many of the adults that were dealing with PTSD, yeah, physical manifestations and lots of ailments that, you know, maybe didn't have a clear explanation, but it was, you know, just the physical expression of what people had been through.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Now, and I know that we have about 20 minutes left, and I do see some questions coming in, which is excellent. But I just wanted to also ask you, I have a few more questions, but we may not get through
Oh,
them
you
all.
did.
But I will ask you. So when you came, your family decided to leave Germany in 1948 and immigrate to Canada. Can you tell us a little bit about that journey and
Well,
where
it
your
wasn't
family
very,
settled?
yeah, it wasn't that simple. I mean, my father, who'd been very active in the Zionist youth movement in Poland, wanted to go to Israel. He had four sisters, three and their families were murdered by the Nazis. One sister was not, because she went to Palestine in 39. So my father said, we'll go to Israel. 48 is, 47, 48. And my father's sister said, no, don't come here. She said, life is very hard after what you've been through. Life here is very hard. And then she said, you will never get a job here. Why? Because he was active in the Beitar, which was the right-wing youth movement. And at that time, labor was in power. So they had to look for work elsewhere. And they couldn't go to the States. You had to have a sponsor. And my father had a cousin in New York, but he was a psychiatrist. He couldn't sponsor an engineer. However, he had a friend who had a friend who knew somebody who knew somebody else in Montreal who had an engineering consulting firm, and he was willing to put his name forward as a sponsor. Now, he didn't give my dad a job when we got there, but at least we had a sponsor. That's how we ended up in Montreal. Came by ship, on which I was sick every day. But then my dad had to find work, and we lived in Montreal for the first few years.
Okay.
So and I learned English very quickly. It was, and my father had to learn English, at work, which he did. It was harder for my mother. He was able to get work in his field. My mother, in order to practice pharmacy, would have had to learn French, because the faculty of pharmacy in Montreal was at Laval University. So we managed. I mean,
Okay. Yeah.
people, we didn't have, there were no there were very few refugee assistance programs around in those days, and you came with nothing. And, you had to, we lived in 2 rooms of this Jewish widow who had a 3-bedroom apartment. And as soon as I learned English, I was a sociable kid. I brought home a friend. Oh, no, that won't do. Too noisy. It was too noisy. So then we moved and we lived with a Holocaust survivor family for a while. And then we lived in our own place, our own flat, with a 1 bedroom and a living room and a kitchen. I mean, it was, it was a slow start, but eventually, and my dad had to follow where the work was. His company went out of business, the company he worked for. So we were transferred to Brantford, Ontario, where we didn't know anybody. But, they went right away to find the synagogue and made friends that they had for the rest of their lives, and whose daughters I've been friends with ever since. And then a year later, my father got a better job in Hamilton, and they lived there for 43 years. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So we were roundabout way, and I came to Toronto when I went to university.
Okay. And that's a wonderful segue. And I did want to ask because, it's unfortunate that your mother was not able to continue her career as a pharmacist,
She
but
did, in
oh,
fact.
did she?
She
Oh,
did, in
wonderful.
fact,
But it
when
took,
it took a while. It took after I went back, after I was married and had children, she felt she was not a joiner. She wasn't a club person. She didn't play, Maj or bridge or anything. And she had such a longing to practice her profession that, yeah, she applied and she had help from my first husband, who was a pharmacist. He connected her with what is Shoppers Drug Mart.
wow.
And so they gave her a chance to work behind, in the front shop. And then she applied and had to make up courses in third year and in fourth year and write licensing exams. But when she finally, and this is when she started, when she was 59,
Wow.
she got back to work when she was 62 and worked for 10 years. And she said those were the 10 happiest years of her life in Canada. And she loved looking after people. So when people came in for their prescriptions, they didn't just get their prescription, they also got some motherly and grandmotherly advice.
Well, I'm sure it was much appreciated. Absolutely. And and so Renata, just before I turn it over to our audience, I did want to just ask because so I know that, you have had an inspirational career as well and a lot of different professional achievements. And I wanted to ask what inspired you to pursue the fields that you studied? And I believe you studied pharmacy as well in university.
Well, that was because, like a lot of other children of Holocaust survivors, you do what you don't want to bring grief to your parents, right? And for my parents, the most important thing was security. And my father wanted me to be a doctor. I didn't want to be a doctor. I always did well in school. I could have gone to medical school, but it didn't appeal to me at all. And so I really didn't know what I wanted to do. So I did what, they said, pharmacy is good. It'll be good when your children are young. You can work part-time. And so I went into pharmacy, but I didn't find it very satisfying. And I worked part-time, I would work, okay, occasional days and weeks and so on. And then when they started to get a little bit older, I got help in the house, and I decided I wanted to do something that was more interesting. And I went in and I got a master's in environmental studies, because that was a very new program at York University and you could do practically anything you wanted. And my parents always said, you need to have something you can fall back on, that you can support yourself. And, they can take everything away from you, but not what's in here. So I had my pharmacy as my insurance policy in case, and I went into the Faculty of Environmental Studies, and they used to call your area of specialization was social change in education. I wanted to create change. I was very involved in the women's movement. So I was an early feminist. I started working when I got my master's. I got a job as a director of the Center for Women at Humber College, and I practically got myself fired because I was a rabble rouser. But I was always involved with education, and education is a tool for change and helping make people's lives better. So then subsequently, many years later, I also got my doctorate in adult education.
Wow. That's so inspirational. And I think, it's a good reminder that, yeah, education never stops, right? We need to continue to grow and challenge our minds at all stages of life.
Mm-hmm. So I was 60 when I got my doctorate. I was at that point president of the Michener Institute for Applied Health Sciences. And I celebrated my 60th birthday with getting a doctorate.
Well, I don't know if I can think of a better way to commemorate
Followed in
your
my mother's footsteps.
Yes, exactly. No, I'm sure she would be incredibly proud. And I think the last question that I know that I'm taking up a little bit of our question period, and I do apologize, but I do think it's worth asking just because, you know, as someone who has worked in higher education and has dedicated so much of your life to higher education, do you have any thoughts at all about, you know, the experience of students on campuses today? And, you know, do you think that Jewish students should feel concern or with the atmosphere right now?
I'm appalled. I'm disgusted. I can't believe it's happening because, you know, my parents always, you know, were very sensitive to anti-Semitism. And I just rolled my eyes at them, you know, because it just wasn't happening. You know, you get a little incident here, an incident there. Okay. So I am actually quite relieved that they're not alive to witness what's going on. And I think that the stuff that's going on campus, I remember I was doing my master's when the Yom Kippur War was going on. And I remember I was asked in one class, well, you know, what do you think about Israel's actions, you know, and blah, blah, blah. But it was never anything like it is today. And I think that yes, I think parents should be concerned and students, and I think we need to put pressure on administration to draw the line that certain, you know, freedom of speech is fine, but not freedom of speech, which is bordering and actually becomes hate speech. And I suggest, and I see that some universities are doing, I think it happened at McGill, that students withhold the part of their fees that go to the student council. The students council that put out this vile
Yeah.
anti-Semitic stuff.
Absolutely. And yeah, that is an interesting strategy when, you know, these student unions are receiving funds from all of the students that are members, and, you know, students should absolutely have a say
Pay
in.
for that stuff.
Yeah, yeah. No, and that's, I think, thank you for sharing that. And you know, I know that it's, you know, as events are still ongoing, it can be difficult to know what that will imply for Jewish students, but it is, I think, you know, there is cause for concern, and I think a lot of people are feeling that right now. So thank you so much, Renata. I'm just gonna go through and look at our questions here. The first question from Christopher Probst. Thank you, Christopher. Um, did Ms. Krakauer maintain contact after the Holocaust with the Polish widow who took care of her?
Good
And was
question.
she active at all in the resistance?
No, no, the woman was not active in the resistance, but whenever I asked my parents, and I didn't ask often because when I mentioned I would like to find her or do, my mother would just become hysterical. I never understood why. And of course, now I do, because having, you know, thought about it some more, she watched through a crack in the attic to see me calling this woman mother, being, you know, being showered with love, you know, having a loving relationship. I think my mother found it probably somewhat threatening to think that I would want to have contact with her, and it would make her, you know, she, in fact, she once used the word, she said, oh, they're just going to blackmail you, they're going to want more money from you, you know. I thought, oh, you know, I don't know. Anyways, so I stopped. Now the interesting appendix to that is I was recently contacted by someone who knew this woman's granddaughter, and she put her in touch with me, and we have been in touch. Um, and she told me, the granddaughter told me that my caregiver had a picture of me on her night table forever, and she still always referred to me as her little daughter. So I was very touched, but unfortunately it was too late for me to actually meet her.
I'm sure she knew that, you know, that you appreciated that
Well,
love
she
that
was
she'd
a,
given,
she
and
showered me with love, you know, but it just was not meant to be.
No, and that's, and I think that it's the difficulty of all of the emotions, and very complex feelings that
Yeah,
a lot of survivors felt in the aftermath, and
yeah, yeah,
yeah, and the motivations for rescuers and all of these
yeah,
things. It's
absolutely.
not simple. Yeah. Um, Another excellent question here. So there's a lot of good questions, but I'm just gonna go to the last one here, which is, what advice would you give to educators in, whether it's elementary school or college level or university, that are facing anti-Semitism and a lack of support from the admin? So, if there's sort of this feeling that a lot of educators, I think, that are Jewish are struggling with right now as well.
Well, I think the one thing that they have to do is they have to get together. Individual action doesn't do much. And I know the irony of it is that the president of U of T is a Jew. And he told me at one point that his mother was a Holocaust survivor. And I can't believe that he is silent, does not, you know, the thing that I think educators have to do is they have to get together, and they have to, one of the things that I support, and I think Simon Wiesenthal Center is doing something about this, is to encourage the adoption of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism by universities. 90% apparently of universities in Europe and England have adopted it, but I don't know what the situation is in Canada. And I think that we as Jews have to say, no, we are not victims like the identified groups for um, diversity and equity and so on, but we are an identifiable group, and there's absolutely should be zero tolerance for hate speech against us. And we really need to have a clarity about anti-Zionism when it masquerades as anti-Semitism, because from the river to the sea means there will not be a Jewish state, and that means genocide. So we have to really, I have not heard some of these horrible slanders that are yelled out in public at Jews, like F the Jews, I can't believe that these are students who are in higher education. So I think educators really need to work on how they can get together and develop strategies to fight this.
Absolutely. I do. You just said so many, I think, important things, but I think the underlying point that, yeah, we need to support each other and work together and band together in the face of anti-Semitism, whatever the context. And certainly, and I'm just reading as well. I know, so I just see some great comments that in the York region, teachers are working together. And I think with the IRA definition, there is pushback in some school boards. Some have adopted it, some
Yep.
have not. But definitely that's a challenge and something that, but it's a real, uh, uh, you know, sorry, I'm just reading the messages at the same time. The IRA definition, we do have that definition available if anyone isn't familiar, but it's available online as well. But it's absolutely very important that we are clear about what anti-Semitism is and when anti-Zionism is a part of that. I'm just looking here. So yes, and I think it's true that it can be difficult sometimes when a lot of people within the Jewish community might feel that there is a lack of concern in equity spaces for the Jewish voice. And so yeah, Jewish people need to be that voice for themselves and certainly not be silent during these times.
Yeah, we're lumped in with all the other white people.
Right. Right. And but also, who's the number one enemy of the white supremacist? So
Right. They don't
very,
they don't
yeah,
consider us white people, and
no,
certainly Hitler didn't consider us white people. He considered that we had tainted blood. We were the lowest of the low. I mean, it for the anti-Semite, any excuse is a good excuse to hurl
Absolutely.
epithets at Jews and to get, to do whatever harm they can do.
Absolutely. And thank you so much, Renata. Is there any final words you want to leave us with before we end today?
No, I think that everybody needs to be alert and fight the good fight. And I guess one of the questions you didn't get to ask me, which I and was going to give me a lot of trouble, was, am I hopeful? And right now, I've been very depressed about what's going on in Israel. But on the other hand, I think that our young people, that's where we have to place our hope. And I know with my grandchildren and their generation, they're going to have to carry the torch.
Absolutely. And by sharing your testimony and your experiences during the Holocaust, you're helping us build that
I hope
defense
so.
for the
I
future.
hope
You
so.
are. I feel that very strongly.
Okay. Thank you, Elena. I appreciate
Thank you. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. Have a great evening.
it. Bye.